welcome to everyone here who is attending or joined the first of two expert voices sessions that we are hosting, looking at the lessons and learning from the private law Pathfinder pilot evaluations. My name's Sophie, and I head up the Family Justice Practice team for the Centre for Justice Innovation, and I have the pleasure of chairing today's event. I'm not going to speak too much to the aims of the pilot, as I know colleagues are going to be sharing this shortly and talking to this a little bit more in their presentations. But I am going to set the scene by saying that the Pathfinder pilot was designed in response to recommendations from the Harm Panel report to reform the private law process and to improve families' experiences. This was about trialling a much more problem-solving and investigative approach to the way that we were working. So it was initially launched in North Wales and Dorset in 2022, and it's since been established in 8 more court areas across England and Wales. So today's event is going to focus on the lessons and learning 1 year on from the Pathfinder process evaluation that was published in March 2025. Next week's event on the 11th is actually going to be focusing on the research looking at understanding families and children's experiences of the pilot. But today we are focusing on the process evaluation. So we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Charlotte Barlow, Dr. Claire Scully and Dr. Helen Richardson Foster to discuss the process evaluations, its finding and its recommendations. Now, Charlotte is an associate professor in criminology and criminal justice at the University of Leeds and vice president of the British Society of Criminology. Charlotte has led or co-led various research projects on gender-based violence, with a particular emphasis on criminal and family justice responses to domestic abuse. Claire is a research associate at the University of Manchester and is an experienced researcher who's contributed to multiple interdisciplinary projects on trauma-informed practice and violence reduction. And Helen is a senior researcher, research fellow in the Connect Centre at the University of Lancashire. Helen's worked as a researcher in university and in the voluntary sector for over 25 years, she has shared with us. And her research interests include domestic abuse, child protection and family support. So you can understand why it was a very, very fitting group of researchers for this piece of work. We are also really grateful to be joined today by Jackie Frisby from the Ministry of Justice. Jackie is the Pathfinder Programme Director, and she and her team have been leading on the implementation of Pathfinder across the different areas in England and Wales since the very beginning. So thank you, Jackie, for joining us today. And lastly, but not least, we are also really pleased to welcome Anna Sinclair to today's session. Anna is the head of practice for Cafcass Cymru, and she's worked in a variety of roles in Cafcass Cymru over the past 23 years, and has very much been involved with the developing and the implementation of the Pathfinder model in Wales since the very beginning. And it's fantastic that we're able to hear from Anna today, because we do note that all of Wales has now implemented the Pathfinder process. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to Charlotte, Claire and Helen to speak to the research directly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. So just by way of a brief introduction to us and the project, as Sophie said, the session today is going to be focused on the process evaluation, which is where we engage with professionals as part of the evaluation, and next week will be children and families. So do come along to that session if you can as well, to hear from those perspectives as well. Next slide, please, Miranda. But just before I begin to talk about the kind of key findings from this work, I just want to introduce a bit of background and context to how these courts were introduced. So in 2020, the UK government published what became known as the Harm Panel report, which looked at how courts handle child arrangement proceedings, and in particular looking at how courts identify and respond to allegations of domestic abuse and other safeguarding issues during those proceedings. And this report found several problems with child arrangement proceedings. In particular, that allegations of abuse and harm were disbelieved or ignored, that abusers tried to control victim survivors through litigation or threats of litigation, and that there were very few cases where the orders made victim survivors feel safe. And there was also sort of broader criticisms related to the inclusion of child voice in the court process. So following the harm panel report then, two investigative approach private law Pathfinder pilot courts, which I'm now going to call Pathfinder, were established in England and Wales from 2022 onwards. And the core aim of these courts was about improving experiences for families, including children who were going through child arrangement disputes in private family law. And this was inclusive of those where there were domestic abuse allegations in the case. So the main aims of the Pathfinder approach then are to improve the family court experience for all parties, including those who experience domestic abuse, delivering a more efficient court process, so reducing delays in particular, reducing the re-traumatization of domestic abuse victims, including children, and reducing the number of returning cases through court, and also adopting a multi-agency approach to improve coordination between the family court and other key agencies. So this is what Pathfinder aimed to do in the pilot sites, but that has also been translated to other areas as well. Next slide, please. So just for those on the call who may not be aware, although I appreciate that many of you will, but just so we're all on the same page, we thought that it'd be helpful to give a bit of a summary of what Pathfinder aimed to sort of do in detail and the sort of model that Pathfinder approaches. So Pathfinder replaced the previous family court process in the pilot areas, which was known as the Child Arrangements Programme, otherwise known as CAP. So Pathfinder model then involves a party making an application to court. This is then checked to see if there are any urgent safeguarding issues that need to be resolved. And once that is done, the case then moves into a assessment and information gathering stage. So this is what we call sort of the front loading of the process. So information gathering much earlier. And so to do this, CAFCAS, local authority and other key agencies complete what is called the Child Impact Report, which involves those key agencies speaking with children, parents and other agencies to summarise the main issues in the case for the court. And it's at this point that if one of the parties suggests that there's been domestic abuse in the case, then the victim survivor will have a risk assessment completed and they are then referred to appropriate domestic abuse services. So once the court then receives the child impact report, a judge then reviews it and decides what to do next. So that might include non-court dispute resolution like mediation, which doesn't happen in domestic abuse cases, I should note, or it may be a fact-finding hearing or other approaches as well. So once the court has the information it needs to make a decision, a final order is made in line with the child's best interests. And in some cases, there may be a review stage which is implemented, which is usually between 3 and 12 months after the final order. And that's when parties are contacted and asked how the order is working for them. So that's the kind of core stages of the Pathfinder process. And this differs to the CAP model, which is on the next slide as well. And the main differences really between Pathfinder and the CAP approach are that Pathfinder includes a dedicated case progression officer in the court admin team who basically makes sure all the family members have key information about the court process and is able to keep tabs on the case to make sure things are progressing forwards. And that's also key as part of that front loading of information gathering in the Pathfinder approach. There's also a significant emphasis on engaging directly with children throughout the process, and that includes much earlier in the process and ensuring that their feelings and wishes are given greater weight in decision making. And it also, the Pathfinder approach also provides direct funding to domestic abuse support services who are an integral part of the Pathfinder process and provide support to victim survivors and also conduct the risk assessment. So those are some of the key differences between those approaches. Next slide, please. So When the Pathfinder courts have been operational for about 18 months, that's when we started to conduct the first phase of the evaluation, which was the process evaluation. So what we wanted to do was to understand how the Pathfinder model had been implemented at both pilot sites, how staff members were experiencing implementing and operating the model, and also to investigate the costs associated with a Pathfinder model to inform any future rollout as well. The kind of core aims there are on the slide for information. So for the process evaluation, we conducted semi-structured interviews with staff from across the two pilot courts, so Dorset and North Wales, and we also identified two comparator CAP courts as well, so that we were able to make those comparisons across sites. So our sample included 67 interviewees from those 4 different areas with a breakdown on the slide there. And we spoke to a sort of a range of people, including court staff, judges, magistrates, CAFCAS and CAFCAS Cymru, local authority and domestic abuse support workers. And as I've said, since this process evaluation, we have since done a second strand of the evaluation, which involves speaking with children and families, which we'll be talking about next week. So do sign up to that. For the financial analysis, I should note that the financial analysis was conducted by our partners on the project, Mutual Ventures, and we can provide contact information for them for anyone that's got more specific questions about the financial analysis. So we'll be providing an overview of that today. But what that involved was building on the interviews that I've just mentioned, but also engaging in additional in-depth quantitative and qualitative data regarding the finances related to Pathfinder. So that's a kind of brief overview of what we did. We can certainly provide more information on that in the chat, but I want to make sure that we now get to the main reason why I'm sure you're all here and some of the key findings from the evaluation. So I'm going to now hand over to Helen, who will start talking through those.
Super. Thanks, Charlotte. Next slide, please. The one ahead, in fact, the one after that, thank you. So yeah, I'm going to outline some of the key findings in terms of the benefits of the process, some of the challenges, and we're also going to cover just briefly about the financial analysis and some lessons for rollout later on. But to take this slide, so looking firstly at the benefits of Pathfinder for families overall. Firstly, the more child-focused element was a benefit. This was recognised as being a central aspect of the delivery and the implementation of Pathfinder. And as Charlotte said, this largely centred on hearing and respecting the voice of the child much earlier in the process in comparison to CAP. And the participants that we spoke to at this part of the evaluation really considered that this aim had sort of been achieved. And you can see the big quote there reflecting the importance of the consistent and early engagement with children. So to have a quick look at that, I won't read it all out, but you can see that person from HMCTS is saying it's about focusing at the earliest possible opportunity. And the advantages that the child can express themselves freely, and the impact on the parents can sometimes be quite profound. And a further key benefit of the approach discussed by the majority of participants was improved information gathering earlier in the process and more effective sharing of information across agencies. And so this earlier investigative approach included contributing better to safety planning, a reduction in multiple hearings, including fact-finding hearings, and overall a better experience for families. So you can see that quote saying that front-loading seems to be connected with more lasting arrangements. That's what somebody from either CAFCAS or CAFCAS Cymru said. The child impact report was viewed as sort of central to this and a real positive change, both in terms of being a more effective and detailed bit of information gathering, but it also put the needs and interests of children sort of at the centre. So collectively, this information gathering meant that the focus had been narrowed to a particular set of issues and the position of all parties was clear at that point. It also enabled more transparent communication with families throughout the process, informing them about it and signposting them to things as required. So participants suggested that this and the case progression officer role was sort of central to that, as you can see in that bottom quote there in the middle. So that led to, hopefully, a faster resolution of cases. Participants suggested that the improved communication, earlier information gathering led to speedier resolution of cases and reduced the number of hearings and less time spent in court. And you can see that quote on the right saying, under the old system, you could have a case going on for 50 to 60 weeks. And if you're a survivor, you might have multiple hearings and to see that person multiple times. So the benefits of the improved timeliness of cases, really clear. So overall, for families generally, the key contributions were the reduction in the number of hearings, reduced time in the system, and reduced re-traumatization, and families being better supported. But if we move on now to specifically benefits for victim survivors of domestic abuse, in the next slide, here we can see where the Pathfinder approach was particularly beneficial and primarily due to the more supportive environment and the process of Pathfinder. So somebody there from Kafkas or Kafkas Cymru saying victims have felt safer, felt more supported and less alone. And one of the ways in which this was achieved was through the inclusion of domestic abuse services who conducted DASH risk assessments, and they developed and implemented support plans for victim survivors tailored to the needs of individuals. These plans might include things like helping to apply for legal aid, putting in place special measures in court, empowering and educating victim survivors, and providing that emotional and practical support. And so professionals we spoke to in both pilot sites described having improved understandings as well of domestic abuse as being a key benefit for them of being involved in Pathfinder. So you can see in the middle there, we've got a quote from somebody in HMCTS saying it had a massive impact on how we manage cases right from the start and throughout the court process. And also, the autonomy of the domestic abuse services was seen as particularly important with getting the risk assessments, with getting either those completed by the local authority or by the domestic abuse service. And this independence was viewed as being key to the success of their involvement. And it led also to increased referrals. So we've got a quote at the bottom there from one of the domestic abuse services that we spoke to saying that there'd been increased contact. We might have people who've been coming into the service that have never been referred via Kafkas, and they end up getting support. So there's a benefit there. And then finally, participants also reflected that this provided a better assessment of risk, knowing what the issues are and better able to assess what's needed much earlier. And that was something that hadn't happened during CAP. So yeah, it's more embedded into the process and allowed, sort of better understanding. So moving on to the next slide, which is thinking about the benefits for service providers. Two ones here. Firstly, significantly improved multi-agency working was highlighted, better collaboration and closer working together through working arrangements, such as in the creation of the Child Impact Report. So this person said, this collaborative from Kafkas or Kafkas Cymru said, collaborative working has really allowed the model to shine and enabled us to do what we fundamentally want to do. And that's been critical in Pathfinder being able to succeed. So agencies were involved earlier in the process and maintained that information sharing in the intentionally time-limited sort of six to 8 week period, if I recall correctly. So the information gathering and sharing there. There was also some shared training sessions in the setup of the new pilot processes, and these were really valuable to participants that we spoke to. The chance to understand what other agencies were doing, to share information across agencies. Both sites said that this was important and helped to maximise the success of the Pathfinder. So you can see there someone from HMCTS saying everyone had the same message. There was less confusion or a lack of understanding. So to summarise, the benefits from the perspective of professionals, Pathfinder appears to have contributed to victims, survivors of domestic abuse and families being better supported throughout. the process is more child-centred in comparison to CAP, and that children's voices are more prominent through the process. And the process seemed to be also reducing the amount of time spent in court for families, achieving a speedier resolution of cases and more collaborative working across agencies. And if we turn now to challenges, I'm just going to begin this section because the challenges raised by participants predominantly did relate to really the implementation of a new process, rather than there being real significant issues with the Pathfinder process itself. But so we've got two different kinds of challenges really. But if I just take this first one, which is about any challenges with the Pathfinder model, the main one here was the review stage. This, as Charlotte mentioned at the top, this is the final stage of Pathfinder, which had the intended purpose of being able to contact parties where appropriate and determine how the order was working for them. But the professionals and participants we spoke to in this part of the evaluation suggested that this stage wasn't really being implemented as intended, and that there was confusion about the purpose of the review stage and when it should be used. So you see that top quote there's the person saying, I think it was vague, it wasn't specific enough as to who was doing it and what the purpose of the discussion was meant to be. So, and also the term review was slightly misleading for some. Some people said that families had on occasion thought that they were expecting their whole case to be reviewed. And a major challenge of the review process was this limited scope for action following review and what would actually happen. There's a lack of clarity about who would be following up safeguarding concerns or risks came up in the review period. So these challenges explain why perhaps it wasn't always widely used in the pilot sites. So yeah, generally there was some issues with the review stage, and in one site, this bottom quote shows, we now call this a follow-up or a check-in. This was felt to be a better use of terminology to sort of explain what this stage was doing. So yeah, if I now move on to the implementation challenges, I'll pass over to Claire for that section.
Thanks, Helen. So as Helen mentioned, the other challenges that were brought up really related to the implementation of the model rather than the model itself. And the first one of these was effective change management. So most participants felt like the change management process had been successfully implemented at both sites, but they did also discuss challenges with change management and also the importance of having those core agencies and people really involved right from the start. And this is something that was needed to make sure that there was that sort of shared approach and understanding and kind of maximise that cultural attitude for change before implementing the model. And some participants noted that getting all stakeholders involved in the process had been a challenge. So, for example, people at both sites suggested that local authorities maybe hadn't been brought into that Pathfinder process early enough. Implementation was further complicated by trying to manage existing CAP cases, which are called legacy cases, which both sites, but Dorset in particular, really described as being quite extensive. And although participants felt like it was really important to clear that backlog of the legacy cases before starting Pathfinder, in reality, that's not something that happened at either pilot site, as the sort of second quote here illustrates. And initially, organisations like CAFCAS and CAFCAS Cymru had tried to have sort of separate people or separate roles for Pathfinder and CAP. But in reality, what happened is that staff ended up working across both systems, so cases across both systems at the same time, which they described as being quite difficult. Next slide, please, Miranda. So resourcing issues were also raised as probably the most significant challenge at both of the pilot sites, and that had flow-on effects for things like timescales and workloads. So some of the particular issues that were highlighted included staffing at Dorset and funding for domestic abuse services involvement at both of the sites, as the first couple of quotes here show. There were also issues with the capacity of domestic abuse services to take on all the cases that were referred to them. And that was really important because their role is something that was seen as fundamental to the success of Pathfinder. And those issues had implications for families that needed domestic abuse support, both during the court process, but also afterwards as well. The limited availability of other kinds of onward support for families, so things like access to contact centres or to parenting courses, were also flagged as another challenge. And again, the sort of shortfall in those services was attributed to a lack of funding. And this was also a concern when it came to domestic abuse perpetrators, as people from both CAP and Pathfinder sites, particularly in Dorset, reported that there was a real lack of perpetrator programs. And again, that's really important given that that kind of availability of, needs-led trauma-informed support alongside, of course, accountability for perpetrators is something that's really kind of key to achieving that behaviour change and tackling domestic abuse in the longer term. So I suppose overall, when it came to the challenges, participants felt like the Pathfinder work was, of course, incredibly important and that they wouldn't want to go back to that CAP approach, but they did recognise that implementing Pathfinder required extra funding, staffing, and other resourcing. And those are some really important messages and lessons for further rollout. Next slide, please, Miranda. So I'm now going to attempt to go over the financial analysis that was done by our partner on this project, Mutual Ventures. So I suppose just a reminder, the kind of aims of the financial analysis were to firstly estimate the unit cost per case under CAP and under Pathfinder, understand which parts of the system drive different costs and benefits, and inform a value for money assessment of the Pathfinder model. So some kind of caveats before we start. In the financial analysis, only direct staffing costs, including on costs, so things like pensions and tax, were considered. And any additional costs, which included things like, interpreters, overhead, travel and subsistence, training, those were all out of scope because they're not necessarily model specific, and they also vary quite widely across different areas and courts. So the analysis of the Pathfinder costs was performed on a business as usual basis to provide the most sort of apples to apples or meaningful comparison to CAP. And it's also not a full cost benefit analysis. So it doesn't take into account things like, the potential socioeconomic benefits of Pathfinder in terms of its impact on, health or police or other services, or its flow-on impacts in terms of things like changes in well-being for children or families. All those things are kind of outside the scope of our analysis. So next slide, please. So with all that being said, what the analysis found was that the direct costs of delivering Pathfinder were broadly equivalent to the costs of delivering CAP. So in England, Pathfinder cost 5% less per case than CAP, and in Wales, Pathfinder cost 1% less than CAP. So more or less very similar. The analysis also found that the complexity of cases impacted on the costs. So more complex cases tended to cost less under Pathfinder, whereas more straightforward cases cost more under Pathfinder in comparison to the two CAP courts. The financial impact of Pathfinder also varied across different parts of the system, and I'll explain more about that in a minute. But overall, the analysis found that the costs of the two models were also quite sensitive to small changes in inputs. So, for example, if a CAP case had one less hearing than average, it then became cheaper than a Pathfinder case. So it was very kind of sensitive to small changes in the different elements of cases. And that means we kind of have to quite carefully consider how we allocate resources in any wider rollout. So next slide, please, Miranda. So overall, as I said, Pathfinder and CAP had a similar cost profile with a few kind of key differences. So the Pathfinder model included additional costs for the provision of domestic abuse services, which didn't exist under CAP or weren't funded under CAP, and those are identified in the interviews as key to the success of the model. In other areas, costs were lower in Pathfinder compared to CAP. So, for example, because there were fewer hearings, there was a saving then in judicial time. And although the overall cost for each case was lower in Pathfinder, the front loading of resources for CAFCAS and CAFCAS Cymru did create a bit of a challenge, and that it meant that all sort of family-facing work happened at the start of the case. So it also changed how costs were distributed over the life of the case. So I think, again, just really important to reiterate that Obviously, these findings are affected by limitations in the availability, comparability, and quality of the data in the family justice system, and they're not able to consider, again, wider benefits or costs. So they don't take into account things like, having fewer appeals or fewer returns to court. I'll now hand you back to Charlotte to sum up.
Thank you, Claire and Helen. So yeah, I'm just going to now sort of summarise some of the key things here that we've discussed and think about sort of key takeaway messages. So next slide, please, Miranda. So we've outlined here on the slide a few of what we see as being the key lessons for any sort of wider rollout and expansion of the Pathfinder model that we think would need to be considered in other areas. So the first is to ensure that there is that focus, maintaining the focus on the child, because this is central to the Pathfinder model. And as we can see from the findings here, it does suggest that this is moving to a positive place in terms of eliciting the voice of the child, but also ensuring that that is kept under review and thinking about what child-centred looks like on a case-by-case basis. Also, emphasis on gathering information early and in a more investigative way. So thinking about the use of the child impact report being a key component of the Pathfinder model, and ensuring that that consideration is given to how that is maintained and balancing that against timely case progression. We do think that there needs to be consideration of the review stage, because the intended aims for that perhaps weren't clear in the pilot sites. So further consideration could perhaps be given on how this could be implemented and communicated to families more effectively. The emphasis continuing to be on building effective partnerships, so consideration about how to gain best buy-in and investment from all agencies really early in the implementation process was key at the pilot site, so that emphasis should be maintained in any other areas. And also thinking about the engagement of key staff and agencies. So the inclusion of domestic abuse support services and the case progression officer role, and that core team involved in the sort of front-loading, gatekeeping early stage of the model were seen to be absolutely fundamental from the perspective of participants. So ensuring that that emphasis is maintained in any future rollout is key. Also considering the sort of resourcing implications of this, because we know, as Claire has just spoken to, that Pathfinder does change the cost profile of a case, with higher costs for some organisations at some stages and lower for others. So that kind of needs to be considered in any future rollout as well. And ensuring appropriate staffing and capacity. Ensuring that there is appropriate staffing at all stages of the Pathfinder model, and also thinking about that prior to it being implemented. And in particular, we would emphasise the importance of capacity of domestic abuse support services. We know that they were identified as being integral to the success of Pathfinder. So with the inclusion of domestic abuse services in Pathfinder, there needs to be that consideration for how they will be appropriately resourced, funded and staffed, especially as we already know that there is crippling underfunding of domestic abuse services more broadly. So ensuring there is that capacity is key. And also, as Claire's mentioned, thinking about that wider landscape of support services, because although we know it's outside of the remit of Pathfinder, if there isn't the available interventions for perpetrators, for example, or parenting support available for families, then that does impact on the longer term success of Pathfinder. So those sorts of things need to be considered. And thinking about the management of transitioning to the Pathfinder model and how those legacy CAP cases will be dealt with alongside new Pathfinder cases. And considering the investment in joint training. So thinking about how all agencies can have those key shared understandings and approach. So last slide, please, Miranda. So basically, what we would like to stress is there are things that do need to be considered in the wider rollout of Pathfinder. In terms of the model, thinking about the function of the review stage. In terms of implementation, thinking about how to manage that effective change management, the legacy of cases and staffing, and the wider sort of resource implications as well. what we can see is, even though those things need to be considered, from the perspective of professionals, there are significant contributions of the Pathfinder approach that does tell a positive story for children and families and service providers, with there being clear benefits for families and children, benefits highlighted from the perspective of victim survivors, and also service providers in terms of that collaborative working and shared understandings. So as I've said, we'll unpick some of this more in the webinar next week from the perspective of children and families, but there's lots of positives to be taken here from the perspectives of professionals in particular. So I will stop there, but I'll hand you back to Sophie.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, Claire, and Helen. A really comprehensive overview of the findings from the evaluation there. And I appreciate this was published a year ago, and there are probably already some updates that we can share on how those recommendations have already been considered and reviewed for some of the newer areas that have been implemented over this last year. So I am going to bring Jackie in to speak to some of this and share some of those updates and perspectives from the MOJ. So come and join us, Jackie.
Thank you, Sophie, and yeah, thank you to colleagues who presented the findings so clearly. As Sophie said earlier, but just for the benefit of those who may have joined after the introductions, I'm Jackie Frisby, Pathfinder Programme Director at the Ministry of Justice, and along with many other colleagues on the call, have been involved in originally designing this, developing it, testing it, and rolling it out into now 10 areas. So have been on this journey from the beginning, and it's a pleasure to be speaking to you today. I will try not to cover too much ground that's already been covered because it was comprehensive, so you might find me skipping through my slides. I'm very conscious that we want to give some time for questions. So Miranda, if we just go on to the next one, and you can put the quotes up as well. I don't think I will spend any time on this one. I won't rehearse what has already been said by Charlotte, Helen, and Claire, but just to say that we still find these quotes very sobering. So the call for evidence was 2019. That's a good number of years ago now. And whilst there has been a lot of work across the system to improve practice, particularly in relation to domestic abuse, and I mean that with every partner in the system is committed to this, there's been some huge improvements, but we do know that there will still be some parents and some young people who have this experience. So I've put them up just to say that we are still taking this seriously. We haven't lost sight of it. It's also probably worth recognising we've had a change of government since this report, since the early sites were launched, but it's still very much a high priority, and it supports the work of wider commitments that have been made by the current government, and wider reforms to the family justice system, as well as commitments around violence against women and girls more broadly. I won't go over any of the other text on this slide, so Miranda, if you jump us on. So this one is similar, I suppose, and some of this was touched on. Those core recommendations from the harm panel have become the objectives of Pathfinder, which are outlined there on the right-hand side. Just to kind of put in absolute layman's terms what we now consider the fundamentals of the model. And I think as you deliver something over time, you almost distill what is happening. So for those of you who work on the front line, what we consider the model to be doing primarily to improve the experience for children and families is condensing what used to be a two-stage model into a one-stage model. So that front loading that's talked about, an upfront early assessment of risk, and then introducing as part of that specialist domestic abuse support, with the aim that the vast majority of cases will just have one social work assessment, so one report and one hearing, which of course is very different to the child arrangements programme, where you would have had a safeguarding letter, a Section 7 report, quite potentially quite a number of update or addendum reports, and certainly multiple hearings. So that's our kind of fundamentals of the model, in case that is helpful. Let us go on to the next slide and keep going. Again, quite a lot of the text on The left-hand side may well have been covered, but helpful to hear that as a government and as a programme, we are picking up on the positive threads that have come out of these findings, and just to highlight what we are continuing to see and hear as benefits, both from practitioners, but more importantly from children and families across the system, which reassure us that the kind of underpinning design principles and the priority that we've put around these key features is worth doing. So the child impact report obviously has been touched on, and what sits behind that for us really is the multi-agency working that goes into it at an early stage, and particularly the early risk assessment. That, of course, I've already mentioned, includes the domestic abuse support, and as we've expanded into new areas, we do now have pretty intentional and focused multi-agency working early on. So I've had the privilege of going around to lots of different areas of the country, lots of trains, lots of nights in budget hotels to present and to speak to practitioners. And one of the most poignant moments for me over the past couple of years has been speaking to a judge in Wales who obviously had seen domestic abuse in their court for years, but was able to really openly say, and I absolutely loved that that leaders in the system are saying this, that the introduction of this model felt like they had, he described it as having scales fallen from his eyes and really understanding what domestic abuse means for families. So yes, having the child impact report and having that specialist assessment is really, really valuable. I think the other thing as part of that is just that we know that there are vulnerable families who previously were not accessing any support. So they will have been living and experiencing this but had no support. They didn't meet thresholds for social care. They may not have accessed any community support, but are now able to have specialist support. And that is just a huge positive for those children and those families. And then the last point on this slide, I suppose, is just that the case progression function that's already been highlighted means that, particularly for litigants in person, they are able to understand and navigate the court process at what is a really difficult time in people's lives. And with this group of people, there'll be many of us who have direct or very close experience of this. Family breakdown and separation is really stressful. You add in a set of court proceedings into that, and we're used to seeing it as professionals, but it is a really, really challenging time. So having someone explain in plain English what to expect, who is going to be in touch, what the process looks like, just means that parties are able to come into court more confidently with a bit more knowledge about what they can expect from the process. Just some of those key facts on the slide here, and I'll go through this quickly. One of the fundamental things we're seeing is there are more children directly involved in their own proceedings. So this is a huge shift, and it's a big reason why there's the cost profile and the balance of work has changed, because we are seeing Cafcass Cymru, Cafcass local authorities are seeing many more children in private law proceedings than under the old model. And then just picking up on a couple that we haven't yet kind of covered, hearings per case I've touched on, but the numbers there are just really stark. So 5 hearings on average under the previous model. Pathfinder is not about efficiency, but it does deliver efficiency. So we have designed it to improve things for children and families, but streamlining the process does mean that we're delivering efficiency. So those kind of stats lower down in that list of bullets, children are not left in uncertainty for as long as they used to be. The cases are closing really quickly. That means that the outstanding case levels in the court, the backlogs are being reduced, both in private law, but also interestingly in public law, as the multi-agency working improves and capacity of local partners is released. Let's go on to the next slide, please, Miranda. So let's just touch on this briefly, and I know people have said we kind of have expanded since, but this is just a bit of a timeline. So yes, it feels like quite a long time ago, over 4 years since we first launched, and it took us a bit of a time to get going in the next areas. And we very intentionally went to South East Wales, which includes Cardiff and then Birmingham, to see what it would look like. They're very different areas and very different system structures to North Wales and Dorset, very different scale as well. So we wanted to make sure that we could deliver this model in an area that a much bigger population, higher caseloads, higher number of applications coming into the court and potentially a more complex stakeholder landscape. Since then, I think we've been pretty regular in our expansion. So again, one at a time in, again, Wales and England in 2025, so last year, and then from autumn last year, we had our first attempt at launching into multiple areas in the same time, not without its challenges, but then followed by our most recent launch into Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. In terms of where that leaves us, if we go on to the next slide, Miranda. So around 25%, just under actually, but around 25% of relevant private law cases are now following this model. We are trying to make sure that there's consistency in that. And I think that this is one of our big challenges as you move from a pilot into trying to mainstream something, is that people have tested things, developed local processes and ways of working, and we are really trying to centralise that now. We are very aware of the resourcing pressures that have already been touched on, as well as the change load, and recognise that particularly for local authorities, there is a huge landscape of change, not just within family justice, but children's social care more broadly, SEND, local government funding. The list is endless. So we are very, very aware of the change load. But we are committed to expanding, developing plans for that. There's a lot of grey on the map, and we're hoping that we will soon be going into new areas and the amount of blue will be increasing. What we need in order to do that is to carry on with the cultural change piece that I alluded to in those first couple of slides. So those sobering quotes and the recommendations from the harm panel, that is a really, really significant shift. And when frontline professionals are very pressured with high caseloads and quick turnarounds, doing the cultural change work requires a lot of support and a lot of thought, but we do have everyone in the system committed to that, and is necessary to ensure the success. If we go on to the next slide, I'm just going to try and pick up on a couple of things, and some of these were in the recommendations. So I will try and just spend a bit of time on how we've moved on since the fieldwork was undertaken for this study. I think it's fair to say we were probably already adapting, and a number of the findings that were outlined by colleagues on the call have either already been addressed or are certainly being thought about. So I think Helen, I think a number have mentioned actually the review stage. So actually that was removed in December 2024. So we've had more than a year now without the review stage. We are still thinking about what ongoing support looks like, particularly where families are receiving support from domestic abuse providers or are known to the local authority. But yes, in terms of the review stage, we absolutely heard loud and clear from this research that it was confusing. We'd also heard from our partners that it was confusing, wasn't being undertaken regularly, and so that was removed. I've already mentioned it, but the multi-agency working, this is just one example of it really. We know that there are more, because of the early risk assessment, there are more children or more child impact reports being undertaken by local authorities than there were Section 7 reports. So we just have implemented some kind of protocols to quickly understand who should be completing the child impact report, and making sure that there is no delay built in early on in the system, as there's kind of to and fro between different agencies in terms of who is taking responsibility. And so much of that multi-agency work happens actually before launch, I would say. So we really learnt from Dorset and North Wales. Again, it's been commented on, just to bring people with us much earlier, to set up local implementation groups, to keep talking, to keep doing that regularly. Over time, of course, the frequency reduces, but people are very, very used to working with each other by the time that we go live with this model. I think the other thing to say is that the domestic abuse provision, which again has had several mentions already, this is the kind of the new introduction really into the system. And I think for domestic abuse providers, it's a very different ask. So yes, of course, we require them to support victims, but we also are asking them to make an assessment to the court, so to aid the court in their decision making. So many of our community providers are used to providing support. They are not as used in the family court context to writing or submitting a summary of their work with the victim in order to inform court decision making. So there's been a lot of learning along the way on that, and we'll definitely continue to do that. And then I think in terms of, it's an obvious point really, but continuous improvement. So in addition to research and findings from colleagues on the call, we are regularly learning as we go from practitioners on the ground. One of the things that we absolutely got right after those first two was the kind of clearing outstanding caseloads. They now have some of the lowest, in fact, many of the Pathfinder areas have some of the lowest caseloads in the country, both for private law and for public law. But we forget that we didn't really pay attention to that in Dorset and North Wales. We just introduced a new model and hadn't thought that that was going to kind of tip the system. It was really, really challenging. And so now we have a long period of run up to launching Pathfinder where there is focused work on reducing those caseloads to make sure that we're introducing something that's going to be sustainable and is not going to mean that the system falls over. There's lots of other areas of learning, but those are probably the key ones. And I should stop talking to allow some time before we get to questions. So I think that's all from me, Miranda. I put some other links which we're very happy to share. That is kind of everything that's been published on Pathfinder, but I do not need to speak to those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. That is really appreciated. And I mean, I know we've been part of conversations, but it is really good to hear how much is being picked up and reviewed and looked at as each area is going live. And there might be a few questions that come to that later on. So I'm just going to encourage people, please do use the question and answer sections. We are running in good time. We'll be handing over to Anna now, and then we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A afterwards. So Anna, please come and join us and talk to us around your reflections for Wales and Cafcass Cymru, because the achievements of implementing Pathfinder across Wales is a significant one. So it'd be great to hear from you.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Fernanda, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, all the presenters, and also Jackie for covering what's changed in the last year or two so comprehensively that I don't think there's an awful lot more that I need to say, really. So yeah, as has been alluded to, when the first Pathfinder went live in Bournemouth and North Wales 4 years ago, just over, it was really a sort of a leap of faith. We had a model on paper and we had a conviction that we knew things needed to change, and we were really eager and willing to implement the recommendations of the harm panel report, those 4 key recommendations. So moving from a pro contact culture to a safety first culture, from an adversarial to an investigative process that didn't pit the parties, parents, against each other, to come out of that silo of where we were really working in a very siloed way with limited information from other parts of the sort of wider system supporting families, and to use our resources more productively. And Bournemouth and North Wales worked really closely with each other. As has been alluded to, there was a very good attempt made to have everybody in the same room to understand and get on the same page of what we're trying to achieve. But actually, if you think back to February 2022, it was a virtual room because it was still COVID on top of everything else we were trying to do. So quite quickly, we were able to see that despite the challenges, this was really making a transformational difference for children and families. So we, the whole kind of North Wales and Bournemouth teams involved, sort of HMCTS, Cafcass Cymru, and the judiciary really were starting to champion, actually, this is something really significant here. So we were so delighted in Wales that we were then able to roll out to a second area and then the third area that covered the rest of Wales. And we found, for people listening who may be another area that Pathfinder's coming to, that each rollout got easier because we knew what we were actually rolling out, and we had some evidence to show what was working. So the early findings of this evaluation were shared with us. So we were able to, although we'd more or less rolled out in Wales by the time it was published, we knew what the learning was from it. And we were also involved in the children and families research that you'll hear more about next week. And prior to that, we had managed in Wales to commission a small survey that was published in 2023 of a researcher working directly with children to hear their experiences. It was around a dozen children, but their sort of qualitative experiences were so striking that all of this really sort of drove our desire to carry on implementing. So our final area went live a year ago yesterday, and within sort of 4-6 months, incredibly quickly, people were saying it was feeling like business as usual because they were so familiar already and were absolutely chomping at the bit to get going because they've seen how successful it was in the rest of Wales. So in Wales, we've filed in excess of 5,000 Pathfinder reports. The children and families referred to us because they've made applications to the court. We've been engaging with around 80 to 85% of the children. And the starting point is we engage with the child unless there's a reason that it's not in that child's interest to do so up front. So before, as part of the first report to court, so the court will have gate kept and allocated that case to either Cafcass Cymru or the local authority. And then the next time that the court considers the case, they have the child's voice and lived experience, as well as the parents' views and a holistic assessment, setting out our recommendations for what needs to happen for that child and family, focused on safety, focused on what is right for the child in the here and now. So we've got away from that kind of practice under cap of trying to leave no stone unturned to make sure that contact happened almost at any cost. And sometimes cases where they become complex and a child was a party, those cases could be running for 3 years, 4 years. That was not the most common, but it certainly wasn't exceptional either. So nowadays, when we started in early 2022 in Wales, the average time for private law case to conclude in the court was sort of 37, 38 weeks. And now it is around 12 to 13 weeks as an average. So children are having to wait, you know, only a few weeks or months to know what is going to happen rather than months or even years. I've already said, I think that key has been those close working relationships at strategic and operational levels, and that they are part of the implementation, but also it's an ongoing piece that those channels of communication need to stay open so that challenges can be dealt with collaboratively. And just to say a couple of things about the future. So for Cafcass Cymru, this practice is embedding, the new process is well embedded, but we recognise we have more to do to ensure that all of our practice is consistent and is of high quality. So we are at that point, I would say, where we have a lot of cases to look at, a lot of information to draw on, to do our own individual deep dives, but also to collaborate more widely. And as part of the ongoing work, we contribute to the programme board and all the different groups that sit under that. So we're feeding in our data, our insights and so on. Some of the things we need to look at is the rate of returning cases. We think it is lower, but you know, with mostly we don't have that 2-year data to look at yet. There's other things like the complex cases in Rule 16.4s and their journeys. And really, we need to focus in Wales on the whole user journey and particularly children's participation to make sure that it is a full participation and not an extracting information process. There will be more about that next week. And then just to emphasise from Cafcass Cymru perspective, as has been said, there's different sort of resourcing profiles needed to keep Pathfinder going post-implementation. And for Cafcass Cymru, we're able to deliver it because of additional investment. And that for us is to be sustainable, it needs to be long-term investment. I think I've hit my 10 minutes, so I'll hand back to you, Sophie.
Thank you so much, Anna. Absolutely perfectly on your 10 minutes, which is wonderful. Thank you ever so much, everybody, for the conversations and the information shared so far. We do have some time for a few questions before we're due to finish at 1:15. And actually, Anna, you already started speaking to one of the ones I didn't mind sneaking in that I was going to ask, which is around that long-term sustainability of practice and recognizing that even once implemented, there is always the opportunity to take on learning and review. So I'm hearing the focus that yourselves have been having in Wales. But Jackie, I just wanted to come to you and ask if you are aware of any kind of initiatives like that taking place across some of the sites in England.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. Yeah, absolutely. So at both the local and the programme level, there's a lessons learned event, there's reviews, kind of post-implementation reviews. Some of those have been in person, they've been big events. More regularly happens as kind of touch points, but again, both at a local and a national level. We are just rethinking the kind of research, learning and monitoring. So I know data in the family justice system was mentioned earlier. It is always a challenge. I think it's fair to say it is improving. I wasn't saying that a few years ago, but it certainly is improving now. And with the private law HMCTS reforms, we will at some point have at least a more consistent data set where we're able to pull data off the system, which will be improved to what we have at the moment, which is very helpful. We absolutely, and I know Cafcass colleagues do this similarly to Cafcass Cymru, deep dives on particular themes and issues that are emerging to understand what's going on and how the model has changed some of the bigger questions that we have around private law. And Anna again has mentioned 16.4 and fact finding. As an example, there are others, and yes, we know obviously the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office published a report that suggested the next phase of their mechanism would include Pathfinder. We are keen to work with them on what that could look like. And yeah, so there's both kind of formal and structured, but lots and lots of informal learning at both the local and a kind of programme level. We of course, as it's a programme, have a lot of governance. We have stakeholder reference groups, we have particular practitioner networks and forums, and they are all generating their own learning that's kind of feeding into our future facing work and decision making.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jackie. Was there anything else, Anna, you wanted to add into that? No?
I think that's perfect response.
Lovely, thank you so much. And I'm just looking at some of the comments that have been coming in for questions, and I guess the first one that I've got on my screen kind of picks up on some of the things we're talking about 16.4 and more complex cases. Jasmine has asked in terms of thinking about how the Pathfinder model incorporates, or I suppose I'm going to say will respond to when there's challenges or allegations around child sexual abuse coming through, given that we know that the co-occurrence of concerns of domestic abuse can often be there. And it's shared that the harm review report has focused on domestic abuse, but we do know there's other kind of serious offences that more investigative approach potentially is going to uncover or start to talk about. So Anna, I didn't know if you wanted to speak to that first, and then I'm going to come to yourself, Jackie, from a more national overview.
Thanks, Sophie. So what I would say is that under the Pathfinder, we are coming in with a much more curious and investigative safety first approach. So there's far less potential than under CAP to see things through a sort of lens of warring parents, which in the past has been a barrier to actually recognising safeguarding. So a case where there are concerns raised about child sexual abuse, we would not be kind of saying, oh, well, we'll just problem solve this and see whether we can get the parents to agree. And, you know, maybe if there's a supervisor, then the child won't be abused. So we can put them in the room with this person who is potentially being accused of some serious abuse towards this child or towards other children. So that would not be the approach. So it would be an investigation, probably a fact-finding mission. In the past, we know that there have been instances where convictions of sexual abuse have not been seen as a barrier to a child spending time with a parent. And then there have been some, you know, sort of high-profile appeal courts overturning that decision. I would very much hope that our practice is alive to that, and it isn't, you know, an ongoing area that we're shining a spotlight on all forms of safeguarding.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anna. Jackie, is there anything else you'd like to add into that?
I'll just come in briefly and my reflections on the way that the model potentially at least addresses this or gives space for this to be addressed is again, I've mentioned it already, but the very early multi-agency work and risk assessment, and the fact that more cases are being undertaken by the local authority. Above that, though, I would put the fact that we are just directly speaking to more children. There's an expectation that Cafcass and Cafcass Cymru social workers, and as you know, said that that's her starting point. That's their starting point. They are being directly engaged as part of this process in a way that was not happening under CAP. So there's far more opportunity for those discussions to happen. And you know, there's obviously a wider piece happening in government with the announcement of the repeal of the presumption of parental involvement. I won't dwell on that here, but you know, that has been announced in the works in progress, which again will help and support kind of the culture change in that regard.
Well, thank you both very much indeed. And actually, that has also then answered one of the queries that's coming in, thinking about more robust responses to kind of allegations around parent contact, parent separation, that was coming earlier in one of the comments as well. So thank you very much indeed. One of the other questions that's come in has been around some interest in understanding about what information is provided regarding mediation, thinking and potentially think about child inclusive mediation. One of the attendees has shared that there does seem to be that there's only around 30% of respondents actually attending MyAMS at the moment in terms of some stats or data that they've looked at. But I just wondered if you guys had any additional information or thoughts around how that's been supported in the process. I was going to say, Jackie, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, well, I will start on that. So we've had some challenges on this. It's worth just making clear that the model doesn't derail the wider commitment to early resolution in cases where it is appropriate. So when private law case applications come in, you know, there is the MyAM process. There is the letter that goes to parties from the president that sets out non-court options where that is appropriate. I will own the challenge that it's much more difficult to do that once an application is being processed under the Pathfinder timeline. So previously, when you may have had a longer wait, a FEDRA, and then an assessment, it may well have they may well have been scope in appropriate cases to kind of divert at those points. I think that is more challenging under Pathfinder because everything is happening earlier. And obviously one of the incentives was you're going to get a decision quicker. We absolutely want to support people to make their own arrangements where it's safe and appropriate to do so. And yeah, I think there are some challenges for us to work through in terms of timeline for Pathfinder.
Right, thanks, Jackie. Anna, is there anything that you want to add in from a Wales perspective?
There's not a difference between England and Wales in terms of the process. So when the application's received by the court, part of that initial gatekeeping in the court is to look at whether a MyAM has taken place or whether there's been an exemption that's been claimed, and whether that's appropriately claimed. That only applies to applicants. So there's not a way of compelling a respondent at that stage to go to a MIAM. And then, as Jackie says, because the case, once it's sent to Cafcass and Cafcass Cymru, is going to be, we're going to be speaking to the child, we're going to be speaking to the parents. So that opportunity to say, oh, could we pause everything while the respondent goes to a MIAM is probably going to complicate and lead to delays for everybody there. The information, as Jackie says, is sent out at the beginning to the applicant and the respondent. And I think the other thing that I would say is that we've noticed and sort of feel that the percentage of cases that actually are coming to court that feature concerns of domestic abuse or other forms of harm are a lot higher than any previous estimates, now that we are sort of more focused on looking at that. So that would be another reason why families who don't resolve their issues in other ways but do resort to the court, that maybe mediation isn't appropriate for them. And that's as opposed to the sort of previous view that people came to court, they came running to court as their first kind of port of call. But more recent research has shown that actually families do try quite hard to avoid court if they can.
Brilliant. Thank you everyone so much. I'm very mindful we are on 1:15 and our scheduled end time. Charlotte, Helen or Claire, was there any other final comments that you wanted to add in before I close today's session?
Just wanted to say that I know that one of the comments that's come in from Louise is particularly emphasising sort of children and families and domestic abuse. And it's just to say that next week, if you are able to make it, Louise, we really hope to address some of those really important points that you've made there. I was just typing it in the chat. So hopefully you can make it next week, because I think that's where a lot of those questions will hopefully be answered and discussed. That was all. But yes, and just thank you.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to say thank you so much to all of the speakers today. And thank you so much to everyone who has been attending. This session will be on YouTube. And I know there's a number of people who had contacted or said to colleagues, will it be recorded? So it will be available in the next week. And we do hope to see as many of you as possible next Wednesday for the follow-up session on the experiences of children and families. So thank you very much, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.